My name's Sarah. I've been in remission from borderline personality disorder for almost 2 years, and I come to you today from my living room floor to share 5 pieces of advice I have for anybody who has or thinks they might have BPD. I'm not a professional, but I do have lived experience and learned knowledge. So why am I on my living room floor? Well, I refer to this as my sad spot, and I'm kind of going through a difficult time. It's more comfortable than my desk. Today's video contains a collection of advice I often want to give people on the BPD subreddits. I'm trying to accept that responding to individual posts isn't the most efficient way for me to help as many people as possible, so I'm going to put this advice here for anyone to access whenever they want. You'll hear me refer to Reddit at times, but don't worry if you don't know what that is. It's just an online forum with different communities called subreddits where people go to talk about stuff. That's where I get the most exposure to the BPD community because there are over hundreds of thousands of members of those subreddits. And on the BPD subreddits, people are often disregarded if they come with questions and say they aren't sure if they have BPD. They're simply told to go get a diagnosis. I totally approve of that in some cases, especially when someone is essentially there asking for a diagnosis. But otherwise, I usually have advice for those people too. Because tip number 1, whether you have a diagnosis or not, is don't get hung up on a diagnosis. I mean 2 things by that. What I don't mean is that you shouldn't go to a doctor for a diagnosis if you have BPD symptoms. I do not recommend self-diagnosis or diagnosis from anyone who isn't licensed to give a diagnosis. But realistically, I know that not everyone can go see a professional for evaluation and treatment. As someone who is fortunate enough to be able to do so and was still misdiagnosed by a handful of doctors over the course of 12 years, I also know that getting an accurate diagnosis can be difficult. So what I do mean is that getting an official BPD diagnosis isn't a requirement to getting better. A diagnosis is based on a set of symptoms, traits, and patterns. So if you have those symptoms, traits, and patterns, it's important to focus on understanding and improving those, even if you're not sure if you really have BPD. Getting an accurate diagnosis was important for me, and I'll share my diagnosis story another time, but I didn't wait until then to start trying to get better. My road to recovery started long before I knew I had BPD. I didn't have clear guidance, and there was a lot that felt out of my control, but I knew there were things I had to learn how to do differently to work towards real change and improvement. That's true with or without a diagnosis, and the sooner you start that work, the better. When I say don't get hung up on a diagnosis, I'm also asking you not to define yourself by this diagnosis. Resist labeling yourself. You aren't a borderline. You're a person with borderline personality disorder, and there's an important distinction there. You also aren't crazy or toxic or broken. You may act and feel those ways at times. I know I certainly have, but they aren't who you are. It's important to be careful about what we tell ourselves about ourselves. It's harder to change these things if you internalize those labels and believe they're your identity. So try not to do that. Instead, I'll recommend that you learn more about BPD, with caution. It makes it a lot easier to understand yourself if you understand BPD as a whole, so please inform yourself on the topic. But be careful about the sources you use, because, like I've said a million times and will say a million more, there's a lot of misinformation and stigma out there. One source I will always recommend is Dr. Daniel Fox right here on YouTube. He's a licensed psychologist who specializes in personality disorders, so he's had a lot of BPD patients and he understands the reality of this condition, and he empathizes with us. He has tons of helpful videos on BPD, so I would suggest subscribing to his channel. And please subscribe to mine if you haven't yet, because I aim to be a helpful resource as well. I also want to highly recommend Dr. Fox's Borderline Personality Disorder Workbook. He did a really great job with it, and I'll talk about it more in another video, but for now I'll just put a link in the description if you want to buy it yourself. I will recommend other books as I vet them now that I know more about this condition. For example, I read I Hate You, Don't Leave Me a couple years before my diagnosis because I did have suspicions that I had BPD, but my doctors told me I was wrong, and I wanted to learn a little more on my own. Then I came away from this book convinced I definitely did not have BPD. Maybe bipolar disorder, but definitely not BPD, because there was a lot of, you guessed it, misinformation and stigma in there. But I'm not just going to tell you that that book's trash and to disregard it because of my experience a few years ago. I've heard they've made some updates to the content, so I recently bought the latest edition and I'll let you know what I think once I'm through. But don't trust literature just because it's published and seems official and fancy. I've also mentioned using the subreddits, and they can be helpful, but again, I will suggest that you use caution there. They are big communities, so they can be difficult to moderate, and they're also filled with a lot of misinformation and stigma, as well as overgeneralizations, bad advice, triggering content. It's just a bunch of regular people talking about what they think and feel, so it's not always the most accurate resource. But it can be nice to connect with people who share similar experiences, especially with a disorder that can so often feel very alienating. The two main subreddits are r/BPD and r/borderline P disorder. I do sort of prefer the latter because it's a little bit smaller and easier to moderate. It's not as all over the place. But be warned that there are also anti-BPD communities on Reddit. One in particular has a very misleading name that makes it seem like it's just an innocent BPD support group, when in reality it is quite the opposite. It can be really damaging to read through. Even as someone who knows that the stigma's wrong and knows the reality of the condition, it's hard to not internalize some of the things you read there, and it really hurts a lot. Please don't go looking for it. I truly don't recommend you go there. But here are the subreddits I would recommend. r/BPD, r/borderline P disorder, r/borderline, r/BPD support, r/BPD recovery. And if you are looking for support as someone who knows someone with BPD, there's r/BPD SOFFA. I'm not sure if that's how you say it, but SOFFA. Significant others, friends, family, and allies of people with borderline personality disorder. That community is not as active, but people in the other subreddits are also happy to help as long as you don't come in bringing hate. We know that it can be difficult and overwhelming and confusing to deal with being close with someone with BPD, and we usually appreciate seeing people in there looking for information to better understand the condition instead of just writing us off. My third piece of advice, which is very important, is to understand your symptoms. In my last video, I explained the 9 symptoms described in the DSM-5. As I stressed in that video, BPD is highly variable, which is what makes it so complex. Think about it. If you need at least 5 of those 9 symptoms to be diagnosed, that means there are 256 different possible combinations of symptoms for someone diagnosed with BPD. And that's without taking their specific expressions into account. So in order to understand your own brand of BPD and work towards recovery, it's important to identify which of those 9 symptoms you have, how severe they are, and what forms they take for you specifically. You can watch my last video if you need a refresher on those 9 symptoms. My next piece of advice is to work on self-compassion and understanding without enabling. Taking an honest and realistic look at our symptoms and behaviors can make us feel really bad about ourselves. But the more you come to understand yourself and your BPD, the more you'll see that your negative behavior patterns developed for a reason. You aren't acting out because you're a bad person. You're acting out because you've learned a negative reaction to a certain trigger, and because you aren't a bad person, you don't feel good about that reaction. So now you can work on learning how to react differently to that trigger. I always say that BPD is an explanation, but not an excuse. It's easier to move forward and make positive changes if we aren't stuck in shame and self-loathing. We can be motivated by those feelings, but don't let them keep you from trying to grow. You can be unhappy with your behavior while feeling compassion and understanding for yourself, while working to make sure you change so you don't keep repeating that behavior. I'll talk a little more about dialectical behavior therapy in my next video, but I do want to mention it briefly right now because it follows this same concept. DBT is a very successful form of BPD treatment, and dialectical is referring to 2 seemingly contradictory ideas, both being true at the same time. So in DBT, that means we can accept the reality of our behavior and our situation and ourselves, while taking steps to make changes in those areas going forward. It is what it is, but it isn't what it will be. I just came up with that myself. Do you like it? My last piece of advice for now is to know that change is possible. It's inevitable if you do the work. It hurts me to see so many people with BPD with a fixed mindset. It's much harder to change or stay motivated to trying to change if you don't believe that you actually can. Your BPD doesn't want you to believe you can, and it will tell you that you can't. But don't listen to it. My good friend has a Mary Oliver quote that has stuck with her that says, "Keep some room in your heart for the unimaginable." She finds this quote helpful, even though she often finds it difficult to have that faith. But as George Michael once said, you gotta have faith. If you don't know that song, I have homework for you. Don't be afraid to challenge your current beliefs about who you are and what you're capable of. Believe that change is possible, and it will be. But change will take a lot of work. And my next video is actually going to be part 2 of my BPD advice, which will focus more on working towards that change. I inadvertently sort of broke down these videos into that DBT dialectic. Part 1 was more about understanding and accepting, and part 2 is going to be more about changing. So please subscribe to my channel so you don't miss that one, and go listen to Faith by George Michael. I love that song, so I'm going to go do the same. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Peace.